I'm talking about food policy and nutrition and government's effect on it. This idea interests me a lot for a number of different reasons. I feel that as libertarians, a lot of people don't pay as much attention to this issue as other issues. It's not as sexy as the Fed or police brutality or marijuana. Pretty much all the libertarians know about that. You know, you talk to any one of them, they'll tell you all the reasons why marijuana was made illegal, but I feel like most people don't really understand this issue that much. They know about something about farm subsidies and, you know, the government's bullshit, and that's about it. But what I kind of learned doing this, all the research for this, is there is so much happening, there's so much fuckery, that in order to really give you guys the best overall approach, I feel like I have to go over the last 100 years of food policy. So to give you guys some idea, there's 12 agencies that deal with loaning farm groups. So basically farm loans, there's about 12 specific agencies and each one has 2 or 3 subgroups. So it's incredibly complex and all the names are so stupid, I'm not even going to tell you them because I can't remember them because they all sound the same and they're dumb. But basically what we're going to do is talk about the USDA and the FDA, which are the 2 main government organizations that regulate food. So the USDA has a budget of $140 million, though most of that goes to a few specific programs. The school lunch program and food stamps, WIC, and then pretty much all the rest goes to government subsidies. The FDA's budget in comparison is only $5 billion, so it's much smaller. So the USDA was founded in 1862 under the Lincoln administration. Didn't do much for about the next 50 years. For the most part, it was just land grants and research. It wasn't until about 1906 that the government really started playing a bigger role. So in 1906, there was a journalist by the name of Upton Sinclair who decided that he wanted to help out all the poor, oppressed socialists. So he went to a meat factory and was appalled at the conditions. And he wrote a book called The Jungle, which talked about just how awful everything was. Much to his disappointment, the public didn't really care about the workers, but they did care about the conditions in the meat factory. So in response, the government passed 2 acts, the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. That was in 1906. This also created the Bureau of Chemistry, which later became the FDA. These 2 acts didn't really do much. They basically said, don't poison the food or put shit in the food. That was pretty much all they did.
Don't kill your customers. Yeah.
So then moving on, 1910, there's a company called Procter & Gamble. They filed a patent for hydrogenated oil. They were originally a soap and candle company, and they were looking for other ways to make money because candles were on the way out thanks to Edison and his damn electricity. So they filed that patent and didn't do a whole lot with it. They were able to capitalize on the anti-meat hysteria that had come from Upton Sinclair's book. But even then, they still weren't able to really get public attention behind them. So, moving on, 1916, the Federal Farm and Loan Act, which set up the initial farm loan banks. It's actually pretty similar to the Fed. There's 12 regional banks, and they basically control all the loans for all the farms in the country. Couldn't find any actual data on just how much money was going into it, but I assume it was a significant contributor to the Great Depression. You know, I just have this sneaking suspicion that somehow pumping tons of government guarantees at low interest rates may have affected that. So after 1916, in 1929, the Hoover administration passed the AMA, which was the Agricultural Marketing Act, which basically this kind of revamped the 1916 federal loan, whatever it was called. And it basically set a fund of $500 million to fund farmers. So that $500 million would go to farmers because prices were dropping. And they had this crazy idea that the depression was being caused by low prices. So they were trying to boost prices for all the farmers. Now the problem with the bill, one of many, was that they put no production limit. So all the farmers basically just produced as much food as they could and sold it all to the government until the government ran out of that $500 million, and that was it. So the problems didn't go away, they stayed. And then 1933, we have FDR. So FDR got it into his head that farmers were the key to fixing the Great Depression. So he passed a lot of different acts. I mean, there's so many. Obviously, if you follow that, there's probably 30 to 40, executive orders that he passed in like the first 2 months. But the one that affected food policy the most was the AAA, or the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which did a number of things, many of them found to be unconstitutional later. But the main thing that it did was it paid farmers not to produce food. So basically they were getting paid to use a portion of their land for nothing. Basically, don't grow anything on it. They were also getting paid to kill their cattle. This was specifically to keep prices down, was the idea. And the way the government funded this was by taxing the farm agencies that built tractors and shovels and other sorts of farm equipment. And obviously that didn't work out well, because the Great Depression went on for another 10 years. Eventually that was ruled to be unconstitutional, and there was all sorts of other things that happened during this time. But that's one of the most lasting things, because the paying farmers not to grow lasted until about 1970. So there was also two important Supreme Court cases that happened around this time. The first was U.S. v. Wrightwood Dairy, which basically said that the federal government had the right to regulate milk if it in any way affected the price controls on interstate commerce. So that's basically all milk. So that Supreme Court Act let them basically mandate milk, which has more or less been centrally planned ever since. The second one was Wickard v. Filburn. Some of you might have heard of that one. It's a very popular case law. That was the case of a farmer, Filburn, who was growing extra food to feed his family. Government found out about that, and they told Filburn that he had to destroy his food because his food affected interstate commerce, because he was no longer buying food on the market, even though he was buying the food that he had sold on the market. So anyways, he lost that, had to destroy a lot of his food, and also kill some cattle. And keep in mind, this is at a time when people were starving that the government was doing this because of the Great Depression. So those things had lasting impact, and those are the major things during the New Deal. If we move on, 1940, Procter & Gamble started funding the American Heart Association, which would later go on to back the low-fats research done by a scientist named Ancel Keys. In 1943, the government put out its first federal guidelines. It was called the Basic 7. 1956, they revised this into the Basic 4. So the Basic 7 was just, here's 7 food groups, try to eat from all 7 of these every day. That's pretty much all it said. It was actually much better than the food pyramid, because 3 of those 7 groups contained vegetables. Wow. So basically you have almost 50% of it saying eat vegetables. That was all it really was. The Basic 4 was the same thing. They just took it down to 4 groups: meat, dairy, grains, and vegetables, or fruit and vegetables was the Basic 4. So that was pretty much their only real food guideline policy for up until 1992, when the pyramid came out. So following that, 1945, Truman signs the National School Lunch Act, which obviously funded school lunch across the nation. And then 1955, President Dwight Eisenhower had a heart attack. Unfortunately, he didn't die, but what are you gonna do? So anyways, Eisenhower had this heart attack. It made national news. He was out of the office in Colorado for like 10 days. But when he came back, he decided to make it public. He wanted to tell people what happened. Heart disease was a relatively new condition at the time. People didn't really understand it, and he wanted to explain it. His surgeon at the time, who was considered to be the best surgeon in the country, had been studying the work of a scientist named Ancel Keys, which basically said, look, don't eat cholesterol, don't eat saturated fat, they will kill you. They will give you heart disease, they'll make you fat, they'll do all sorts of things. So Eisenhower publicly endorsed Ancel Keys on TV and said he was following that diet plan. Now, Ancel Keys was kind of an interesting scientist. He had no evidence at all at this point when he had convinced everyone. He had put out his first study. It was called the 6-country analysis. Now, the 6-country analysis, he presented it to the World Health Organization in Geneva the same year that Eisenhower had a heart attack, and he was basically laughed out of the room for mistaking causation and correlation. Basically, every scientist who was there just laughed at him and told him what a terrible study it was. Now, the main way he had done the study was he looked at food in 6 countries in Europe. And when I say 6 countries, he actually looked at it in 22, but he chose the 6 that perfectly matched the ideas that he had already. which he had gotten in his mind because he visited Naples the year before and found that they had no saturated fat in their diet after like 2 days there. Created this idea, then he got the 6 countries' dietary information. Now first off, that information came from food surpluses during World War II. So it's basically the amount of food that was delivered to these countries at that time and that was available for consumption. That's where he got his numbers from. It had nothing to do with who was actually eating it or anything like that. But basically he took these 6 countries and he created a perfect line graph that showed the more saturated fat you eat, the higher your risk of heart disease is. It's basically perfect across the board. So he got destroyed for that at the World Health Organization convention in Geneva. That did not sway him. He continued to keep working on his research. In 1961, Time put him on the cover, and in 1978 he released a 7-country study, which was basically considered the Bible from then on as far as nutrition was concerned. So we're going to jump ahead to 1972 to the Nixon administration. So in 1972, Nixon was running for re-election against Senator George McGovern, who would be a future food warrior shortly. So at the time, he had an agricultural secretary by the name of Earl Butz. It's a terrible name, and he was a terrible person. He was only in office for about 4 years because he couldn't stop saying racist things. He eventually was forced to retire because he said, "I'll tell you what the blacks want. It's loose shoes and a tight pussy." So he was forced to resign after that. He also mocked the Pope with a fake Italian accent, too, while we're at it. So Earl Butz's main goal as Secretary of Agriculture, at least in the beginning, was to get Nixon reelected. So they were worried that George McGovern would get a lot of the farmer support in the Midwest, which was where he was from. So what Earl did is he organized something that has come to be known as the Great Grain Robbery. He convinced all the farmers that they could sell all of their grain surpluses to Russia for a huge amount of money. And that's exactly what they did. They sold 10 million tons of grain to Russia at extremely low prices because it was subsidized. So at a time when they were at war with Russia, they sold all this food to them. There was also massive shortages that were going around the entire world. So immediately following the sale, everyone panicked. Prices shot up, some as high as 400%, and the farmers made tons of money twice over. Once from the sale, and then the second time from the increased prices. So this action essentially won Nixon the presidency in I think the second greatest landslide in the last 50 years, other than Reagan. So George McGovern was thoroughly defeated, and after that he went to go work on the Senate Selection Committee on Nutrition, which became the main science behind the first set of dietary guidelines that was released in 1980. But Earl Butz wasn't done. What he also did was he basically publicly announced that farmers need to fix what they're doing. So he repealed the restrictions on acreage allotment, so farmers could now grow as much as they wanted, but they were still being subsidized the same way. So basically their profits all shut up, they all started making tons of money, and he made statements like, "Get big or get out," is what he said to the farms. He said, "Plant commodity crops from fence row to fence row." This was his whole plan. He encouraged low interest loans, and basically everyone got as much money as they possibly could, and all these farmers made a lot of money for a couple years. This created a pretty large bubble, which in 1980 burst, and more than half of the farmers went bankrupt. So continue on, 1973, the McGovern Commission. So George McGovern was pretty sad after losing the election. He watched a special on TV where a kid went to school and didn't have any food and decided that that is appalling. As Senator George McGovern, he is going to fix that. So he got involved in the committee, and they basically reinvigorated the WIC program and food stamps. They got a whole bunch of money behind that. It was more or less dead until he got back into it. And then they also started developing a whole bunch of science, which they basically called the McGovern Commission and the McGovern Report. That science was based mostly off the work of Ansel Keys, and the only reason he didn't head it was because he was more or less retired at that time. It's also based off the work of a man named Nathan Pritipkin, I believe is how you pronounce it. who believe basically the same things as Ansel Keys. So in 1978, Ansel Keys publishes his 7-country study, which dramatically affects food guidelines, and it has for years since then. It's basically, or at the time, it was heresy to question it. The former director of the Framingham Heart Study, who was one of the biggest studies ever conducted, lost his research grant for criticizing Ansel Keys. So in 1978, there was the Energy Tax Act that was passed by Jimmy Carter. So there was a man named Dwayne Andreas, who was the CEO of a company called Archer Daniels Midland, or ADM, which is currently the second biggest farm agribusiness in the US. So this guy he's a pretty interesting character. Let me just get into what he was about. So he contributed to every political campaign for the last 50 years on both sides. He's probably the single greatest political entrepreneur I've ever heard of. And I'd never heard of him until I started doing this research. It actually came out later that he was the one who directly paid a few of the people that were involved in the Watergate scandal. The money came directly out of his pocket. He also gave Nixon $100,000 in cash, which Nixon had to return to him before getting impeached. So Dwayne Andreas was the CEO of Archer Daniels Midland, and he realized they were producing a ton of corn, thanks to all the subsidies. Now the problem was they couldn't compete with sugar at the time. In 1976, they had actually pulled back the sugar taxes, and it was more or less unsubsidized for a couple years. So what he did is he went to Jimmy Carter, first off, and said, we need a 10% tax break on ethanol. So Jimmy Carter gave him a 10% tax break on ethanol, and then he also convinced Jimmy Carter to give them about $400 million in loans. So both of those went through, which essentially helped fund ADM. But that wasn't quite enough for ADM. They still weren't making enough money as much as they would like. It was somewhat cyclical, so they needed to make more money on a product called high fructose corn syrup. So this was discovered sometime in the late 70s in Japan, and they realized with the excess amount of corn that they had, they could start selling high fructose corn syrup at extremely low rates, but they were still losing money on sales compared to sugar. So, like a Midwestern Machiavelli, he funded sugar lobbyist groups in Florida in the early 1980s, and they helped get the tariff of 1982, the sugar tariff of 1982 passed under Ronald Reagan. So once that passed, 2 years later, in 1984, both Pepsi and Coke on the exact same day announced that they were switching to high fructose corn syrup from sugar. Meanwhile, back in 1980, when the farm crisis started, so all these farms basically, they had so much debt, they had to liquidate and sell. So all these big companies, Cargill, Archer Daniels Midland, DuPont, they bought up all these small farms. The total amount of debt at the time it had risen to $215 billion, which was double what the debt was in 1978, and that was 15 times the 1950 level. So in 1980, the first set of dietary guidelines for America are published, mostly based off the McGovern Commission and the McGovern Reports. This is actually one of the first times that they said, maybe you shouldn't eat sugar. Prior to that, sugar was generally looked at as a health food. If you weren't feeling good, eat more sugar. You got a headache, eat more sugar. Fat was the real problem, cholesterol was the real problem, but you wanted to stay away from sugar.
I want to live then.
So in 1992, the nutritional food pyramid was finally released. So they were going to release it.
Thank God.
Triangles. Tell us how to live.
Triangles aren't true.
So they tried to release the pyramid in 1991, but they got massive pushback from all the different industries. The cattle industry was especially upset because they were in a very small section. A lot of different industries did not like basically how the pyramid came out, so they gave them a lot of pushback. So in 91, they spent a year revising the entire thing. They spent $500 million, 450 designs, 29 focus groups, and didn't change a thing. Except for the way the noodles were drawn. That was the only thing they changed on the pyramid. Yeah, they changed them from macaroni noodles to spaghetti noodles. And technically they also changed the chopsticks. They were green, now they're white. So that was the only thing they changed. Now the pyramid recommendations were not followed at all. There was a nutritionist named Louise Light, who they had hired in 1979 to develop the pyramid. It took them 12 years. Not really sure why. I couldn't find any information on that. But basically, her and her team, they put together a pyramid that was, the bottom of the pyramid would have been vegetables. Anywhere between 5 to 7 servings of vegetables. Fruit was number 2, meat was in the middle. They said, keep your sugar relatively low, don't eat processed grains, don't eat refined grains. They sent it to the USDA for approval, and they changed everything. So obviously grains went to the bottom with no differentiation between grains. And Louise protested. She said, if you do this, there will be massive obesity and probably a lot of diabetes. And their response was, well, people on food stamps can't afford it otherwise. So they published it, and that was pretty much the end of the food pyramid. So 94, Congress passes the DSHEA Act, or the Dietary Supplement and Health Education Act. This is actually a relatively good act. Basically what this says is if you want to put out a supplement, you can put it out. If it hurts people, someone has to prove that. They have to prove basically a negative impact, and then the supplement will be recalled. And that was pretty much it for that one. 1996, they passed the FAIR Act. The goal of the FAIR Act was actually to scale back the subsidies and to let the free market reign. So they did that for about a year, and of course prices went down, and everybody freaked out, so they slowly brought everything back and then increased it, of course. Because all the senators in the Midlands need the votes, and they couldn't stand for that. One of the things, though, that it did actually, at the time, was it got rid of, there were still a few of the production quotas left, so it got rid of those, except for fruits and vegetables. The production quota stayed in place on that one. 1999, there was a Supreme Court case, Pigford v. Glickman, which the USDA was forced to pay out $2 billion for racially discriminating against black farmers. They still haven't paid out that $2 billion. It's been, 18 years since then? They paid out maybe half of it. There's been all sorts of court cases, and most of the people from that trial, I think, are dead at this point. They paid out, I think it's roughly half of the numbers. 2006, the FDA mandates that trans fats be labeled on food as long as they are over 0.4 grams. So if you buy any particular item of food and it has 0.5 grams of trans fat on there, it should say it on the label by law. If it's under that, they can round down to 0. So, and that's per serving. So if you could have 50 servings in something, and every one of those servings could have 0.04 grams of trans fat, and you're getting a ton of trans fat. And then in 2013, a man named Fred Kumaro sued the FDA for not banning trans fats 50 years ago when he warned them. He published his first study in 1957, where he basically took rats and gave them huge amounts of trans fat. They developed osteosclerosis, I believe is the word. I have a hard time saying that. And then he took the trans fat away, and their disease went away. He also looked at the autopsies of about 100 different dead people, found out that they had massive amounts of trans fats in their arteries and in their coronaries, and that was most likely what caused the heart attacks, as opposed to saturated fat.
Real quick, is trans fat when somebody's skinny but they dress fat?
We can only dream. Trans fat is something that comes from hydrogenated oil, which is the process that Procter & Gamble patented in 2010. So the whole anti-saturated fat campaign slowly pushed everybody towards trans fats, because trans fats were not required to be on labeling, whereas saturated fat was. So you look at a label, and this is up until 2006, you look at a label, it'd say something like 15 grams of saturated fat, there's no trans fat listed. There might have been 20 grams in there for all you knew, but they didn't list that. And so people thought it was heart healthy, as they said. So 2014, the Farm Bill was passed, and it is projected to cost taxpayers over $1 trillion in subsidies. And then in 2015, the FDA actually banned trans fats. They are giving manufacturers and food companies until 2018 before they actually remove them. But in a year and a half, it will be illegal to produce or sell anything with trans fats in it. So that's kind of the whole timeline I wanted to go over. I wanted to talk about a few specific examples of how government hurts our health. So the FDA will not let you put certain labels on food unless it meets their guidelines. For example, if you have more than 3 grams of fat in your piece of food, you can't say it's healthy. So they recently sued, I believe it was Caldara, because they say healthy on their packages. They're like fruit nut bars that occasionally have a little bit of sugar in them, but you can't put healthy on there. You can, however, put it on a Pop-Tart because there's less than 3 grams of fat in a Pop-Tart. Avocado is also not healthy by that standard. I haven't looked at every one, but I would imagine so.
Starts my day.
There's multiple laws. These are mostly state laws. They're usually referred to as ag laws that specifically prohibit people from either documenting or talking about abuses that happen on farms. So again, it's at the state level, so not everywhere, but a lot of places you can get sued or possibly even go to jail. I don't know if that's ever happened. A lot of public schools will not let your child bring home lunch if it doesn't meet their specific criteria. I couldn't find exactly what the criteria was, but in Canada, it has to meet, you have to have 1 grain, 1 meat, and 1 dairy, or they will literally send your food home, and they will, your kid can get suspended for that. I imagine it's similar in America, but I couldn't find the exact information on it. So I wanted to also talk a little bit about the total amount of food that is produced in America. So to kind of give you some effect of what some of the corn subsidies do, the total tonnage of corn in America per year, at least in 2013, these numbers are from 2013. So corn, there was 354 million tons of corn produced. The next highest was milk at 91 million. So corn actually is more than the next 10 products combined. Or no, I'm sorry, it was 9. The next 9 products combined. As compared to beef, it's only 11 million, which kind of shocked me. So it's a pretty interesting situation with corn and say things like beef and the ethanol industry. They're basically subsidized twice. So if you look at corn gets direct subsidies. They're one of the only things to get direct subsidies. Sugar mostly deals with tariffs and quotas, whereas corn deals with tariffs, quotas, and then they also get agricultural risk coverage, price loss coverage, marketing loans, disaster aid, marketing and export promotions, and research and other support. Pretty much all the research is done by the USDA, which of course is in favor of their programs, because why would they do research that said their programs were bad? But when it comes to something like ethanol, which doesn't directly affect our health, but ethanol is basically subsidized in 4 different ways. 1, the corn is directly subsidized. 2, they get a 10% tax on ethanol. 3, there's sugar quotas, so you can't produce enough sugar to compete with them, and sugar is actually more effective at ethanol. And then 4, there's huge tariffs on foreign ethanol. So ethanol is probably the most subsidized industry there is, and a lot of that comes from corn. So that's kind of the general gist of it. And I'm more or less done, so.